amount of energy. But there's a lot of recent data with the new satellites, which can observe from above the atmosphere, and are finding the great importance of the magnetic fields and the great importance of the variation in output of the sun, and how the particulate matter, the radiation and particles from the sun, influence the atmosphere, and that in turn influences the weather. And so when we find that there's a cyclic phenomena, and it has to do, the temperatures, in other words, follow the path of the variations in the sun. And as a matter of fact, it's been shown that the climate on Mars has been following this same path, and ain't no CO2 being produced by us Earthlings up there on Mars.
Oh, there must be SUVs up there.
That's what it is. You got it.
You know what? The whole idea, I mean, I think what cankers science is when politicians get involved and realize there's one tax or another that will fatten the federal checkbook or suppress one industry or another, according to the votes they can supply. But this is really no change from the early days that we've been talking about, from the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, when the crown would authorize the genocide of one race or another so their lands could be confiscated. I mean, the Bible is full of divinely commanded genocide. So has science changed at all?
Different areas, but no. What hasn't changed is people. It's not the science. It's people's need for being important, for being powerful, for having the opportunity to lord it over others, to use an English phrase, I guess. And we don't seem to have made much progress in changing that. Human nature, so to speak.
Yeah.
And there's always a bad guy. Remember, we're good and they're bad. I remember during World War II, there's comments about the Japanese and the Germans. We demonized them. Look how we put the Japanese in those internment camps.
Yes, we demonize them and we dehumanize them. And maybe it is that people are the same age after age. They have their prejudices, they have their fears, but these generally aren't the people that are doing the peer reviews. They're not the people that are at the heads of these institutes or institutions that analyze the data and supposedly can make some third party a fair decision. One of the things Kathleen and I were talking about before the program was the parapsychology industry. In the early parts of the 20th century, a tremendous amount of money was spent by most of the developed countries on parapsychology, and I've read a few books on it. So much clinical data was collected, but the conclusions were never made. The analysis was never brought forward. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that. It's such a tremendous area, and really, I think now we're seeing a resurgence in it. We're seeing psychic healers and intuitive counselors, and a real gift coming forward now. So, Kathleen, tell us a little bit about the coming of age of parapsychology.
Well, parapsychology, as you mentioned, has been conducting independent replications of controlled experiments performed thousands of times by researchers around the world, and they have demonstrated statistical evidence in support of psi phenomena. The problem was that they were accused over and over again of bias in their experiments, that even if they weren't aware that the bias was there were human variables in there. Perhaps the cards were bent, or perhaps when the experimenter and the experimental subjects were working together, that something on the experimenter's facial expression would cue the psychic or the person participating in the experiment to give the response that was expected. And over time, scientists who were working on psi phenomena on these experiments asked the skeptics to come in and help them to design experiments that would eliminate these human variables. And they ended up coming up with a great telepathy experiment. It's called the Ganzfeld telepathy experiment. It was developed in the early 1970s. And in this Ganzfeld experiment, there would be a sender and a receiver. And they would be isolated in soundproof rooms. And the receiver would have ping-pong ball halves covering his or her eyes, and there'd be white noise in the room. And then the sender would be isolated in a separate soundproof room. And then over closed-circuit video, it would send random images, such as nature scenes or photos of different things, and that would come into the sender's room, and the sender would telepathically attempt to send this image to the receiver. So they did everything they could to eliminate this human variable element where they might not get accurate scientific results. And in doing this over and over again, they did it over 2,500 times, they came up with lots and lots of evidence that telepathy is real. Now,
were there people that were particularly gifted at it, or could everybody learn it? Was this a natural human characteristic? Or
what they found is that some people were particularly gifted at it. And if they had a person who was a gifted psychic in one room and maybe a friend of that person in another room, the experiments had much, much better results.
Because the wavelengths were familiar to one another. They knew the thought patterns of what was going back and forth. We had Dr. Edgar Mitchell on this program, and he talked about the experiment that he ran with telepathy while he was going to the moon, because he wanted to prove whether or not thought could actually leave the planet and go to the moon and back. And although Olaf Johnson prematurely exposed it to the press, which kind of took away the thunder and allowed some criticisms to come on the experiment, it was very statistically significant that Edgar Mitchell was receiving images that were being sent to him telepathically from Earth, and he was writing them down all through the mission on his knee pad, and that was, I thought, fascinating.
Yeah,
Edgar is a very gutsy guy. You know, he wrote the foreword to my book, Flying Saucers and Science, and he talks about Roswell because he grew up around there, incidentally. Not everybody has his courage, but we're so lucky that people like him, some of them, are willing to speak out. You know, we want to put the kibosh on anybody who pretends to be or seems to be different. Sometimes, and in Flying Saucers and Science, there's information on public opinion polls. And what one finds often is that even though most people believe a particular phenomena exists, like telepathy, let's say, or UFOs, they will act as if they didn't because people they think would think they were a nut.
Yeah, exactly.
So it gets in the way. In other words, a lot of progress is being delayed because, well, you know, I didn't report what I saw because they think I was a nut. I actually ran a little experiment in a class. This is not fancy, but I asked them to close their eyes and vote with their hands, and I would ask some questions, and their instructor and I would count the votes. It had to do with whether they believed that most people believe in UFOs, most people didn't, etc. And would you believe 80% thought most people didn't believe in UFOs, but 80% of that very group did believe that some
That's amazing.
Extraterrestrial spacecraft. And so the resistance, the fear of ridicule or disdain from respectable people would stand in the way, whether you were talking about telepathy or UFOs or seeing what goes on inside somebody's body. There's a whole chapter that Kathy did about, what's her name, Demkina.
Natasha Demkina. Yes, Natasha. It was in the side chapter, where she was a medical intuitive, and she took part in a medical experiment in the United States, and it was recorded for the Discovery Channel in 2004. And she thought that she was actually working with some of the top scientists in the world. She traveled from Russia with her mother. She was a young girl, and she had been deceived. It was actually the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry, and it was then called SICOP, the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal. It's a debunking group. And they designed an experiment that would increase her chances of failure. They placed her under stress. They made sure that she was good and tired and suffering from jet lag. They were hostile to her, she claimed. She wasn't able to read people the way that she usually does. And a medical intuitive that I did a radio program with told me this is extremely important. You have your way of doing things. You have to have people alone, and you have to read them individually. This committee lined people up close together and asked her to read conditions that the committee had already determined these people had. They would say one person had it when actually 2 or 3 in the group might have had it, but she had to choose the one. So there was a lot of bias on the side of the Committee for Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal. And when she did extremely well, when she would have passed this test by international standards, they raised the bar. And she actually signed a paper saying that it was all right with her, that she didn't know. She had no one who was knowledgeable about this to advise her. And the poor young girl ended up crying at the end of the show, claiming that they were biased, that they had mistreated her. And in fact, they actually had.
Wow.
But a number of people came to her side and supported her side of the story. One of them was Brian Josephson, Ph.D., the Nobel Prize-winning physicist and director of the University of Cambridge's Mind-Matter Unification Project. And he criticized the experimental team's methodology and motives. So she did have people on her side who were supporting her. And later follow-up studies, for example, in Japan, said that there was significant evidence that she actually did have the ability that she claimed to have.
Well, I have met individuals who have this ability to be able to look into you or look into another person and see an injury. And honestly, I've even met them that can do it over the phone. They don't even have to be next to the person. They can just visualize the person as they're speaking to them on the phone and tell them where this ailment is, what this problem is with them. And sure enough, they go to the doctor, and there's an old splinter that's festering, just like she said, or